another edition of Coastline. Well, there's an old saying that goes, the only thing that you can't avoid are death and taxes, and that's true, but maybe you're interested in how those taxes come about. And our special guest this week is Gary James. He is the assessor for Beaufort County and is currently very involved in a massive reassessment project throughout Beaufort County. Gary, good to have you on Coastline today.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. And wow, I just looked at your presentation here, and you've been busy in your office, haven't you?
Yes, we've undertaken this reassessment every 5 years, and it's implemented this year for tax year 2018, and it includes a great deal of prep work since the last reassessment. And given the financial roller coaster we've been on for the last 10 years, there's a lot of anticipation as to what has happened in Beaufort County since the last reassessment.
Well, I know that our viewers are probably on the edge of their seat wondering how it's going to impact them. And I was actually made aware of some interesting things that I had misassumed. First of all, your assessment process is not directly going to affect the property values, or I should say the taxes that people are going to pay, because you're under a mandate to keep what's called the revenue neutral position?
That's correct. I'll get to that in my presentation at a later date to try and lead folks and you up to how we get to that point.
Okay. Well, so why don't you go ahead and start the presentation then, which, by the way, if anybody is interested in having this presentation for their very special group or civic organization, you can contact the assessor's office and we'll give that information at the end of the show. But right now you're presenting to the city of Port Royal, the town of Bluffton, the city of Beaufort, as well as getting ready to present to the various council people so that they will have some idea of where you're proceeding on this, right?
That's correct. We have planned presentations. All of the council members have started to set up what they call town hall meetings for each of their districts, as well as the various different municipalities, community groups like realtors, Chamber of Commerce, Property Owners Association, what have you, that may want to be able to have a presentation and the opportunity to ask questions and get a little bit more. One of the reasons we do that is to minimize the lack of information and educate the public as to what impact it has on them and their taxes and their pocketbook, and how it isn't as scary, and try to allay the fears that this isn't as big a deal as it may seem on the outset, because it is sort of balanced with that revenue or neutrality, which I'll get into in a minute.
Okay.
But, basically, we undertake this, as I said, every 5 years. The effective date of our value is December 31st of 2017. Everything at that snapshot on time, what was it worth? So we're doing real property. It takes place the fifth year, and we then implement. At the bottom of this slide, you'll see that it talks about implement a program and assess all property on the newly appraised values. We use what's called a computer-assisted mass appraisal program. It's a computer system that helps us do modeling, puts all of our data into the system so that it can be saved and utilized to do what we call standard appraisal methods, common data, and using the statistical analysis, much more tech savvy than it used to be 20 years ago when we first did these.
Because there are a number of variables that fit into how you come about getting this reassessment. Aside from the sale of various properties in any given community, which you get that information, you also have notification from the licensing bureau of any home improvement licenses that have been taken out. And you also have a staff of 15 people that are going around checking every single parcel in Beaufort County, right?
We make an attempt to get to every parcel. We did not get to every parcel. We don't have to inspect every condominium because it's difficult. You can't sort of walk around each condo unit when it's a high rise or something. Vacant land, we do from aerial photos and look to make sure that there isn't anything on the property. We don't have to inspect it. We can tell from aerial photos. So we're using some of the technological advances as well as trying to get to all the commercial and residential and properties that exist in the county as best we can. We didn't get to all of them. There are 128,000 parcels in Beaufort County. It's close to 129,000 now as we subdivide properties and grow. But we've been to about 70% of all of the improved parcels in the county, which is about, there are about 80 to 85,000 parcels with improvements, buildings, docks, decks, patios, anything that has a structure on it.
Right.
So we've been to well over 50,000 of those over the last couple of years, some of the others over the several years. The state sort of encouraged us to get to every parcel within that 5-year period. So over the last 2 years, we've been fairly busy getting out there doing the inspections. But as I said, we implement this every 5 years. In 2003 and 2008, because of the nature of the data and changing over to new systems, we implemented it a year late, but we're back on schedule in 13, and now in 2018 we'll be implementing this. Just to give you an idea, what we're talking about here, if you go down to the bottom of this slide and you look at the real property, this is what we're talking about. The personal property is taken care of through other offices, the auditor who's responsible for personal property and vehicles, which we don't have data for right now. But my focus is the real property, which is mobile homes, improved properties, real estate, buildings and vacant land. And you can see that in the tax base or the overall taxes that you get a real property tax for, that forms the ad valorem tax base, is about 92.5% of the total tax bill. The rest is personal property.
Okay, so your department is very instrumental in providing the revenue for the county.
The tax base revenue, that's correct. Just looking at some numbers, you can look at the trend of values. Obviously back in 2008, the overall market value for the county was about $46 billion. That's every parcel, all the values added up for the entire county in 08. In 13, obviously due to the recession, we dropped to about $34 billion, or loss of almost 30%. And then this year in 18, our market value has rebounded to almost back where it was in 2008.
That's interesting. I would have thought we would have surpassed it by now.
Well, a lot of folks felt that way, but you know, you lose value pretty quickly in a recession like that. But as you notice, we have surpassed it in the sense of the taxable base, because there's a cap that you place on the market value. Every 5 years, we're limited to increasing the value only 15%. Unless there's a sale or new construction. But you see that the cap value in 08 was just under 37 billion, and right now we're just under 38 billion. So we have in fact increased the tax base, not the market value, because it's been capped, but less has been capped now than was capped before, meaning the values are higher relative to the taxable amount.
Okay, that makes sense. So from this, we can see that by and large, the majority of residents are holding on to their properties, and just a small percent have sold within the last 5 years or made major improvements. So the capped value has gone up incrementally from what it was in 2008.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. Well, I'll just go back quickly, but you can see that there was a drop in the interim in 2013.
Sure, yeah.
But in terms of maintaining back the value, this just shows the change from 03 to 08. We had an increase of almost 60%. That was the growth period in the early 2000s when everything was going nuts. But in 08 to 13, that reflects the drop in the overall county value of about 25%. And now we've gained the 22% or 23% back. Those are just a summary of the same numbers we talked about in the last slide. The important one is to show that there is growth, it is reflected, and again, these are market values. These are not cap values. When you do look at the capped or taxable value, it only dropped 11%, but this year it increased about 7%. So the capped value or the taxable value has not gained what we lost in that first 013 drop. But we are back a little bit toward the prior numbers.
All right.
This is what impacts your taxes, is this number to a point. As we talked about revenue neutrality, we'll get to this. This is just value of your property as a whole in the county. Let me switch gears for a minute and talk a little bit about the reassessment schedule and what has occurred to date. As I said, we inspected over 50,000 parcels. We've done an analysis of all the sales. We've created land models, finalized construction cost, valued new sales, which is assessable transfers of interest. We've gotten approval from DOR that our numbers make sense. They're in line with the sales. We're not trying to fool anybody. We're not fabricating anything. It's all sales-based, market-based.
DOR being Department of Revenue?
Department of Revenue, State Department of Revenue. They guide and set parameters on everything we do. We then delivered preliminary values to the administration to try and work on their budget and work with that revenue neutrality. I presented this similar presentation to council in April, and now I've begun presentations to, and these are the organizations that our goal is to get the information out. We're not trying to hide anything. We want to be transparent. We want to share with anybody who's interested if they have a community or a public entity that is interested in hearing about this. In late August or early September, we will be sending out assessment notices. These are the notices that say on your individual property, this is what the new market value is that we've determined for your property, what the capped value is, which tells you how much of that market value is actually going to be taxable. If there was no sale in the last 5 years, it limits the increase to 15%. In most cases, that may not have gone up that much anyway. There is a stub on the appeal that is included in that, so folks can appeal that. It gives folks an opportunity.
How long does that appeal process take, and will it occur prior to the tax bill being generated?
Good question. We've switched our date of notices. There's a 90-day appeal period that follows any notice, and a notice is any written communication about value from our office, whether it be a notice or a bill. If you get a notice, you have 90 days from that. If you don't get a notice, 90 days from the date you get the bill or the date it's mailed. In this case, every parcel in the county will get 90 days from the date of the notice, which we have now moved to be closer to the 1st of September, give or take a week in that time frame, so that the 90 days will overlap when the bills go out.
Does that appeal have to be in writing?
It has to be in writing. As it says here, it's a multi-step process, in writing, signed, and the reasons for appeal, whether it's the market value, the assessment ratio, whether you're getting legal residence or you're not, and you don't think you are, and you should, so that you can appeal the classification use. If you think you should be classified as agricultural or forest land, you can appeal that.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more about that appeal process right after this break.
I'm from South Carolina, and my vote counts.
I am from South Carolina.
The Palmetto State.
Mi voto cuenta.
I'm a South Carolinian, and my vote counts.
And my vote counts.
This year, thousands of South Carolinians will vote using the newest, most advanced voting technology in the world. Every vote matters, and every vote counts.
I'm from South Carolina, and my vote counts.
Well, we're talking property reassessment and the mandatory revaluation that's taking place every 5 years. Our guest on Coastline is Gary James. He is the Beaufort County Assessor. By the way, if your organization would like to book him for a speaking engagement on this very topic, you can call his office at 843-255-2400. That's 843-255-2400. Just ask for the assessor's office. Also, you can find out more information at bcgov.net. When we left off, Gary, we were talking about this appeal process, and one of the things that you mentioned was classification and use. So I know that agriculture comes in at a really low level. Can I go ahead and have my house and property reevaluated as agricultural?
No, there are very specific laws that regulate what is classified as agriculture, it's made to be a benefit for farmers, and there are limitations on acreage, on use of that acreage. Generally, if it's a forest or timber, it's marketable for commercial purposes, not just a vacant lot with 10 acres or 5 acres of woods.
Yeah.
And then crop, obviously, is self-explanatory. If a farmer is using it or owns it, they can get that benefit to try and maintain the use of that property in agriculture.
We were saying that once that postmark notice arrives, the recipient has 90 days in writing to respond if he or she disagrees with the evaluation, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, carry on.
Okay, and we have timed the date of that notice, or plan to time the date of that notice, so that it will overlap when the tax bills go out later in the fall. So that if people ignore or don't receive for some reason the notice, they will receive a tax bill. Most people don't ignore the tax bill. They will have probably an additional 30 days remaining of that 90-day period to appeal. So they sort of get 2 shots. The first one is 90 days. The second is the remaining period when they get that bill. So we're really trying to, normally we have that bill, the notice go out in July. Your period expires before the bill comes out.
Will that notice they receive reflect the old and the new assessed value, or just the new assessed value?
It'll have the new assessed value. It may have the old value. It'll have the capped value, which is the actual taxable. So that if your property is taxed, but the market has gone skyrocket in your neighborhood, and you haven't sold or purchased that property, then you're limited to that 15% increase, so it would reflect that. On the next slide, I have the notice that we sent out in 2013. We have not revised this for this year. This is difficult to see on this slide, but it does talk about the values, the taxable value, and what the assessed value would be, which is whether it's valued at 4% or 6% for the taxes.
Now, you probably didn't get many people that appealed their assessment in the last one because everything was assessed downward. But in years where you don't have a major drop, do you get a lot of people that request a revaluation or an appeal?
We get anywhere between 8 and 14%. So if you have 129,000 parcels, we're looking at somewhere between 10 and 20,000 appeals.
And of those 10 or 15%, what percent do you go ahead and say, yeah, we were wrong, we will reevaluate it again?
Very few. Most of them are questions. What I don't understand what this means. So that eliminates a great deal. It's a 3-step process. You can protest, you can just say, I don't understand. You know, most people get confused between the market value and the taxable value. It's capped. The second phase is, okay, you don't like our answer, you can appeal, and that's when it becomes a true appeal, and our appraisers look at the value very closely if they're not happy with our first response. And that gets narrowed down to usually less than about 1,500, 2,000. And then those who are still not satisfied, we may have dropped the value, but it wasn't enough for their satisfaction. We've used comparable sales, whatever typical methods of valuation. Then they can go, then the next step is to appeal to the Board of Assessment Appeals. We usually get a couple hundred that do that step, which is a board of citizens who hear your case and rule on that. Then there's extensive court procedures you can follow after that. Generally, that's not the case. We usually either come to a meeting of the minds through negotiation, or the board comes up with a favorable response for either one or the other, and it's dropped at that.
Do you find that the majority of appeals don't really come in until those people actually get their tax bill and see the impact the revaluation has had on them?
I won't say it's a majority, but it's a huge percentage. Somewhere between 40 and 60% wait, and it could be 30%. Most people are expecting an increase. We did get a lot of appeals because people didn't understand in 13, even though the values were down. They didn't understand what implication this has.
Yeah.
Or they didn't understand the bill. What does this mean? Does this mean my taxes are going to go down? So they were the other way. Oh, yay, my taxes are going to drop. Well, in fact, they may not have, because of the individual parcel or the revenue neutrality, which we're going to get to.
And aside from the revenue neutrality, which we're going to get to also, county has its budget that it's currently working, and it may decide that they need to increase the millage rate, correct?
Correct, but that's limited as well. And I'm going to show you on one of these slides how that impacts after the revenue neutrality equation comes about.
All right.
What I want to talk about here is this just shows the difference in the land and the improvements on the land from 2017 to 2018. The reason that I use 2017 here is that that's the values that were fixed from the last reassessment plus the new growth that occurred from new construction or subdivisions, new homes, et cetera, and sales. So you can see there was about a 15% increase over the prior year. That's important because that's right about where the cap would come into play. But that's just, okay, last year's bill reflected this year's bill is going to reflect that. But overall, when you look at the market value change per district, and this is just a snapshot as to where the growth has occurred, and don't take more out of that than what that is because the percentages are impactful merely in the market value from prior years. The important ones to note are the negative numbers, St. Helena and Fripp, which are in red, where there's a slight decrease in value. Those numbers may be a result of many different factors, including Hurricane Matthew, with a loss of some improved structures on Harbor Island and Fripp that may have been reflected in less properties to be valued. Obviously, the value of Fripp is relatively low considering the magnitude of some of these other areas. You don't have as many parcels. One parcel has a larger impact than others. The second thing to look at is the intense growth. These two here are Bluffton's two different districts in Bluffton that show an extraordinary amount of growth, as well as about 18 to 20% in Port Royal.
Yeah, I was surprised by Port Royal's growth. Does that have anything to do with them changing their boundary and expanding, or is it just actual property values?
Both. There have been a lot of growth in subdivisions, new homes in some of these regions, and understanding what's included in these districts. Port Royal has a lot of new construction with apartment complexes, townhomes, single-family homes over in the Shell Point area, as well as some others that are part of that boundary. And then in Bluffton in particular, there's a huge amount of growth. Yeah. One of the fastest growing municipalities in the area. But this is just a graph that shows the difference between the growth of 17 and 18 by district. Taxable value is where you have the cap. And what this means is that everything is capped at a 15% over the 5-year period. However, this limit does not apply to additions, improvements, or recent sales. So that's the part that doesn't fall under the cap. That's important to know because when you look at the capped value, you'll see that some caps don't take in place. For instance, in the town of Bluffton, District 610, you have a 22% increase. That's because there's so much new construction that doesn't fall under the cap, and that's why that one is higher. You can also see the cap that now other districts have fallen into a decrease in the cap value. However, let's look at what really impacts your taxes. And this is the assessed value. And that takes into account the 4 or 6% assessment that's applied. And this is where Fripp and Defusky, where there have been some changes, both in hurricane and home ownership, whether people are now considering it their primary residence or not, that will impact these numbers as well.
Okay.
Just very quickly, this is just to show the red is the areas that showed a decrease, and then on up on the scale to the purple, which showed the greatest increase. The yellow and the brown and the light green are really close to minor increases. Revenue neutrality basically is calculated by multiplying the tax revenue or budgeted amount divided by the value of the county. What that means is that if the county values, and if you look at this first number here, if the assessed value increases by what ours is increases of 6.8%.
That's for the entire county.
For the entire county as a whole, not individual parcels or even individual districts, then the mill rate must be determined to maintain a neutral budget. So if the budget for Beaufort County last year was $100 million, This year it needs to be $100 million. It means that if our values went up 6.8%, then the mill rate has to drop in order to maintain that same mill rate or budget. Then you can add in cost of living increases and the growth. So if you were to look at this in a quick summary, you have the net increase in those numbers. That 6.84% included 3.8%, which was the reassessment change, and then the allowable growth, which is not capped, which is 3.03%. So the total increase in the total reassessed value is 6.84%. Then that number is used to determine the revenue neutrality, and then on top of that, you can add in the limitations to growth, which is CPI, Consumer Price Index, and population growth, which determined by the state was 3.9%. So you have an increase in reassessment, and then you have allowable growth. This number here is the amount above the tax base from last year that the county can increase the budget. It doesn't mean that an individual tax rate is going to be that high, because now remember, we've got growth in real property, which people have more improvements, and the CPI, which includes population. So if the population of our area increased by 2%, of that 4%, 2% is more population, more subdivisions, more additions. So those things are then added on top. So it doesn't mean the budget might increase, but the allocation to each parcel may not go up as much.
Exactly. And remember, the takeaway from all of this is that this is a county-wide program that individual properties may see a greater or lesser figure than the average that you've come up with, and that will translate into a greater or lesser property tax than they may expect.
Right. If an assessed value increases greater than 6.84 or 7%, then your taxes may go up, because you have 7% up in values that determines the base, but then there's a decrease in the mill rate. But if your property went up 10%, the 7 and 7 cancel out. You've got that extra 3% where the property may have gone up in value. If your property is less than that, your taxes may go down on that individual property.
Well, our time has completely slipped by us, and if people are interested in knowing about their particular area, you have this presentation that extends beyond what we've talked about, that actually looks at different parts of the county. So people may be in the Burton area and want to see what the scope was there. They can go to one of the many presentations that are going to be held over the next several months. And again, they can call your office if they would like to schedule something for maybe their service organization, Exchange Club or Rotary or something like that, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Gary James, who is the Beaufort County Assessor, thank you so much for this very informative decision. We'll be looking for correspondence from your office in August?
Late August, early September.
All right.
And thank you, Rick.
All right. Thank you. And that's it for this presentation of Coastline. Join us again next month.